Hello and welcome to episode 82 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa. And we don't really have anything for me to give an introductory preamble with regard to. For example, I'm almost completely recovered from the disease that I had recently. And so I might as well just jump right into these, just dive headfirst into this list of questions. And the first one is from Luigi. And Luigi says, if karma is only a mental state, what are you to say if I feel good stealing? I would not generate negative mental states to guide negative volition. Maybe it would not generate negative mental states, or I would not generate negative mental states to guide negative volition. Well, it's not just stealing. There are some people who enjoy killing. For example, just the thrill of catching a big fish or shooting a big buck deer. Or for that matter, some people get thrills from killing other people. Some people think they're going to go to heaven for killing other people. And so, of course, they're overjoyed at the opportunity to kill other people under such circumstances that they think that they're going to go to heaven because of it. Or maybe a more obvious example is adultery. I think most of the people who commit adultery are experiencing some kind of enjoyment while they're doing it. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't want to do it. So, just because you are feeling pleasure when you're doing something doesn't mean that you're not going to get bad karma for indulging in that action. In fact, sometimes just the wallowing in sensuality is what causes the bad stuff to come back to you. That's one reason why it's like whatever we love the most or whatever we're most attached to or most addicted to is what gets us. It's like in the Pali text, it says whatever it is that you're attached to, that's what Mara uses to trap you or hook you. So just because you feel good doing something doesn't mean that you're not going to get unwholesome karma for doing it. But also there's just different levels of consciousness. And what's going on at the surface level might be very different from what's going on a little deeper down. For example, if you're messing somebody up and at the superficial level, you're enjoying it. You're like the droogs in A Clockwork Orange who are just laughing uproariously while they're beating people up and raping women to death and so forth. Still, deeper down, there is the awareness that you are hurting other people. And maybe a total sociopath, someone with no conscience whatsoever, no empathy, probably they still have it. It's just that they're just blocked off from it. But the average person does have a certain amount of empathy or just awareness of what they're doing, sort of the deeper implications of what they are doing. Even if at the surface level, they don't want to know about that. They just want to do what they want to do. So karma is only a mental state. It is essentially volition or will. But that doesn't mean that just because, you're smiling and laughing while you're doing something, that nothing bad is going to happen to you as a consequence. Because it really doesn't work that way. In a way, it's just your karma is seeking equilibrium. And it's going to do whatever it takes for that equilibrium to be reached, so to speak. It's never completely reached until you become enlightened, I suppose. Or maybe even after an enlightened person dies. Because we're always making new karma and sort of adding to the disequilibrium. But it's sort of like water seeking its own level. And it is a little bit difficult to explain, which you may have already perceived in the roundabout way I'm answering this. But, for one thing, you can get bad karma for just wallowing in sensuality. It doesn't even have to be adultery. You could just be picking up some wench at a bar and taking her home and whatever. And, still, because you're wallowing in sensuality, because you have these cravings and attachments and so forth, you are creating karma, and it's not all going to be good stuff coming back to you because of that. So, yeah, karma is just a mental state, but If you feel good stealing, it's probably at a superficial level, and deeper down, you don't feel quite so good. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question here. I'm sorry if I didn't answer that first one adequately, because Luigi does seem to have a certain amount of skepticism with regard to Dhamma. At least that's the impression that I get. So I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Lieberlam. And Lieberlam says, if you don't mind answering, who did you vote for? And he's referring to the previous Q&A. I had voted in the Republican primaries that day. And I had like this I voted sticker stuck to my shirt. And yeah, I mean, there was only one position that you voted for. I mean, there was a few, like a referendum or something. There was a few of those. But it was mainly just the presidential, the candidate, the Republican candidate for president of the United States. And there was a surprisingly long list, including some guy named Binkley that I'd never heard of before. Although I've after the primary, I heard that he had dropped out and endorsed Donald Trump. So yeah, I voted for Trump. This shouldn't be a big surprise. I mean, Nikki Haley is the closest thing he's got to an actual contender, which, I mean, I don't know why she's staying in the race. I assume she's just hoping that, somebody's going to take down Trump and she'll be the last one standing. But a lot of the people voting for, a very significant proportion of the people voting for are not even really Republicans. They are like Democrats or left-leaning independents who are voting in open primaries, voting for her because they don't want Trump to be president. And then in the final, the main presidential election, they wouldn't vote for her anymore. They'd vote for Biden. So in order to help prevent that from happening, I made sure to go and vote for Donald Trump for Republican candidate. And he deserves it, in my opinion. I mean, he has taken so much crap. I mean, just a biblical onslaught of crap from the globalists in general, not just the Democrats, but the globalists across the board. So, yeah, just as a way of sort of showing the establishment what we think of them. I think a lot of people are voting for Trump just mainly for that. Sort of like in 2016, Trump was called like a middle finger to the establishment. And I think in 2024, he's going to be like 2 middle fingers. So I'm just going to move on to the next question here. This is from Pranav. And Pranav says, my first question is that from the time of receiving predictions to becoming a Buddha or Pacceka Buddha or chief disciple and Maha disciple, their respective period of time is given to fulfill the necessary paramis, but there is no fixed time period for an ordinary disciple who just wants to be an arhat. What do you think the period could be? I've read on a book by Letty Seattle that it takes 100 to 1,000 mahakappas for an ordinary disciple. And this is really just arcane, like, I mean, it's dogma, essentially. I mean, there's no way you could really verify any of this. But yeah, it is true that in order to become a Buddha or a Pacceka Buddha, like a hermit Buddha that doesn't teach, or a chief disciple, which has accordance with some sort of unwritten law, I guess, that there are always 2 chief disciples for every Buddha. And our Buddha Gautama had Sariputta and Moggallana. And then you have the great disciples, of which I don't know if there's a fixed number. I think there's like 80 in this version, this dispensation of Buddhism. There were like 80 great disciples. And supposedly, according to tradition, that in order to become a Buddha, a Pacceka Buddha, a chief disciple, or a great disciple, there has to be some announcement from a previous Buddha in the past that, I mean, you would meet this previous Buddha in a previous existence, a zillion gajillion years ago, and they would say, in a future life, when there is a Buddha named, Gautama in this case, you will be a great disciple. And in Burmese, it's called a Byādate. You have to get a Byādate in order to get one of these higher ranks of enlightenment. But personally, I just don't think that it's really dealing with objective facts. That this is just a development of like legendary Buddhism, starting with the glorification of the Buddha himself, making him at a rank way above an ordinary enlightened being, which I don't think is necessarily the case. Like I've discussed previously that, like in Abhidhamma, which I think we're going to have a question about that a little later, that wisdom is the same as amoha. Wisdom is the same as lack of delusion. And any enlightened being is going to have zero delusion. So any enlightened being is going to have exactly the same amount of wisdom. Just going with logic and what the tradition itself teaches. So I do think that it's sort of an anachronism where you're saying that there are different levels of enlightened being. And, each level has this time period of millions or kappas of eons. And a kappa, I'm pretty sure that a kappa is defined in the texts as you've got like a block of rock that's like 10 miles on a side. It's just this huge mountain block of rock. And it's like every 100 years, I think, or every 1,000 years, that this little bird flies by with a silk handkerchief in its mouth, and the handkerchief brushes up against this block of rock that's approximately 10 miles on a side. And an eon, or a kappa, is the amount of time required for that every once in 100 years or 1,000 years that handkerchief brushing against this rock causes the entire rock to be worn away. And so, according to Ledisiero, according to Pranav, it takes 100 to 1,000 mahakappas, and a mahakappa might be bigger than an ordinary kappa. Maha meaning a great kappa. Who knows? It could be 1,000 regular kappas. I really don't keep up with this stuff because I consider it to be irrelevant. It's like this is just legendary stuff that really has nothing to do, in my opinion, with practicing Dhamma and, developing mindfulness and wisdom. So, yeah, I think it's just all academic, and I don't think it really matters. But I assume for an ordinary enlightened being, it's going to be a different amount for different people. Some people make slow progress, other people make fast progress. And I don't even think you have to have the Byādate or the announcement just to become an ordinary enlightened being. So, there wouldn't even be a specific time when the timing would start. So it might not even apply. Because, maybe it would, no, it wouldn't even be starting from the time you become a Sotapanna. So, what would be the beginning time for someone who hasn't received this announcement from a past Buddha? There would be no initial starting point to time the amount of time it would take to become an ordinary disciple. And an ordinary disciple, I assume he's referring to a disciple of the Buddha, so at least you'd have the good karma of meeting a Buddha face to face and becoming his immediate disciple, even though you're not one of the great ones or one of the chief ones. And I don't know what tradition says about it. I've never really had any interest in that, which is kind of similar to Pranav's next question here. Second question is that there is 3 kinds of Buddha: the faith-based, the wisdom-based, and the energy-based, or Sada, Panya, and Virya. How does this 3 kinds differ in the Bodhisattva to fulfill their paramis? Again, I think this is just made up stuff that has nothing to do with objective reality. This is legends. It's folklore. So, just going with just for the sake of argument, to say that there are 3 kinds of Buddhas: those that are based on faith, those that are based on wisdom, and those that are based on virya, or just manly effort. How are these three kinds differ in the bodhisattva to fulfill their paramis? I mean, the paramis, or the 10 perfections, there are 10 of them, and I assume, let's see, Sada isn't one of them. Panya is one, but it's not really in the... Panya is one of the 10 paramis, or Panya or wisdom, but I think it has a different meaning as one of the paramis, because there it just means like quick wit, like thinking on your feet kind of a thing, not like transcendental wisdom. Virya, or energy, is one of the 10 paramis. Did I just say wisdom? Virya, or like energy, manly effort. So, and like virya has the same Proto-Indo-European etymology as like the word virile, or the triumvirate in Rome in Latin. So, yeah, I mean, questions like this, you're probably better off asking a Burmese Seattle, seriously, because the Burmese Seattles take this stuff seriously. They consider it to be objective historical fact. They don't consider it to be made up legends, which is pretty much the way I view it. So I have read about this stuff, but because it wasn't really interesting to me, I didn't really retain it very well. You can find books that discuss like the different kinds of Buddhas, and the different route that they take to become the Buddha, just based on the different emphasis of their enlightenment. I do think that the faith-based doesn't take, well, maybe it takes different lengths, different numbers of eons and eons for them to become enlightened. But it's all just legendary stuff, and I don't think that it really is empirical fact. So yeah, you're just gonna have to look in a book or ask a Burmese Sayadaw, who the Burmese take this stuff really seriously. If it's in the commentaries, it's gospel truth as a general rule. So yeah, look it up in a book or ask a Burmese Sayadaw, because this kind of stuff, it's really just irrelevant to the essence of Dhamma, in my opinion. So the third question from Pranav is, I already pretty much answered this in the comments. We had kind of a back and forth a little bit in the comments, but it is a question that was in the comments below a Q&A video. And so he says in this question, where did you find, I think this is from, not from a Q&A video, but from a different video. It says, but I don't remember now. It says, where did you find that Nātaputta means son of grandson? And then he has a laughing emoji. And then he says, in modern Indian languages, Nātaputta would mean son of the Lord, ! Not as Lord and Putta as son. I think you had mispronounced the word not. To understand it as grandson, it should be pronounced as Nāta, to mean grandson. And that is, we're referring to Mahavira, the founder, or at least the last great Tirthankara, or teacher of Jainism, who was a contemporary of the Buddha. And in the Pali text, he's referred to as Nātaputta. Not Nata, N-A-T-H-A, Putta, but N-A-T-A, like N long A-T-A, Putta. That is how it is spelled in the Pali text, and it means son of grandson, which is like a joke name, because the non-Buddhist teachers in the Pali texts are propagandized to some degree. They're made to look like charlatans and fools. And the founder of Jainism was no exception. And so he was called Nātaputta, which is spelled N long A-T-A, P-U-T-T-A. And that means son of grandson, which is like a joke name. But apparently, according to Pranav, in Indian texts, they have it spelled differently. So it's N-A-T-H-A, Putta, which means son of the Lord. But that's not how it's spelled in Pali, and that's not the meaning of it in Pali. In Pali, the meaning of it is in accordance with the spelling of it, which is son of grandson, which is a joke name. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Texan Buddhist. And Texan Buddhist says, is there any part of you that wants to leave your lay life and go back to the monk life? And not really, no. I mean, there are times when I do kind of appreciate all the leisure time that I had as a monk. I didn't have to work hard every day or 40 hours a week. So, I mean, the lazy part of me kind of, in a way, kind of misses the ability to have all of this leisure time to just do whatever I feel like doing instead of, having to go to work every day. But not really. I mean, yeah, there really isn't any conscious desire at any level, really, for me to go back and become a monk again. So, I mean, I took that as far as I could get with it. And now it was time to do something else. And I don't regret that or have second thoughts or any such thing. It's just continue moving forwards. So I'll just move on to the next question. This is from White Ash Piper. And this is sort of a revised question that he already asked. In a previous Q&A, he asked me, who was the one famous sage or saint who would best fit the role of Kwai Chang Caine in the old TV show Kung Fu? And I couldn't really think of anything. I mean, it's kind of, I thought maybe me even, just because I couldn't think of anyone that came closer because of all there's various criteria. Like you have to be at least half Caucasian. You have to be like an outsider, like in the country in which you were a monk, a Buddhist monk, and then you have to stop being a Buddhist monk abruptly, come back to a different country where you're also an outsider, that sort of thing. So anyways, the question here from White Ash Piper is, I guess a better approach to my grasshopper question, and grasshopper was the name that his beloved Master Po called Kwai Chang Caine. I'll start again. I guess a better approach to my grasshopper question would be, if David Carradine rejected the role of Kwai Chang Caine and a sage of old auditioned for the role, who would best fit the role if all sages, mystics, and such auditioned? Well, that's kind of a, it doesn't make the question any easier. It's still kind of the same question. And it's hard to believe that most sages and saints would even want to audition for the role. I mean, just as a given, let's just assume that all of them did. I mean, who would come closest? I don't know, Bodhidharma maybe? I mean, there would have to be these criteria. Like, he'd have to be like an outsider in the country of his birth and then an outsider in the country that he returns to after he stops being a monk. And in the original TV show, he stopped being a monk because he murdered the nephew's emperor, or the nephew's emperor, the emperor's nephew. And so he was Parajika, and of course he couldn't stay in China because he was going to be arrested and probably executed in some really nasty way. So he fled back to America, which is where his father was born. And he was like half Chinese and half American, half European. So, yeah, I mean, trying to find anybody who would fit that criterion is just, I'm in no better position now than I was in the previous Q&A when I was trying to answer the question. But at least Bodhidharma was an outsider in one of, I mean, he was an outsider in China anyway. Whoever, maybe the founder of the Shaolin tradition, but then again, he might have just been pure Chinese and didn't have all these other things that fit. But then again, maybe White Ash Piper is just asking with regard to character traits or something. And yeah, it's just really hard to say. It's no easier than last time. So I can't think of anybody. Because, I mean, the criteria of Kwai Chang Caine are pretty specific. And then also the saints and sages of ancient times, I mean, as a general rule, you don't know what their personality was like. You just get these legends handed down, maybe some of their writings. But when they're writing, they're being serious and they're not, they're not really displaying a whole lot of what they would be like wandering around in the Wild West in the 1800s, dealing with rednecks that just don't like Chinamen. So, yeah, again, I really can't answer that question. I don't know. Bodhidharma, maybe? I don't know. I'm just going to move on to the next question here. And this is from Mooners. And Mooners says, what does the election of 2020 have to do with Buddhism? And I assume this is a question that is maybe kind of a complaint or a criticism. It was, I just mentioned the election of 2020 very briefly when I was discussing how I got a video taken down by YouTube because I happened to mention a certain forbidden subject. And I mentioned that I just got that confused in my mind with the election of 2020, which it is now apparently allowable to criticize on YouTube. But this other subject is not. And I got those confused in my head. And so Mooners is asking, what does the election of 2020 have to do with Buddhism? So to me, I wonder, why they would ask the question. Because, it was just sort of a in passing kind of mention of it anyway. So, it's possible that they could just be super strict Buddhists who only want to hear about Buddhism and don't want to hear about anything other than Buddhism. And I have had interactions with people like this before, although, he could have mentioned any number of other things. So it causes me to think maybe it's possible that Mooners is like maybe politically and socially leaning to the left and just doesn't want to hear about that stuff. He just kind of strayed onto my channel somehow. But what does getting back to the question though, what does the election of 2020 have to do with Buddhism? Not very much. You can say that everything has something to do with Buddhism. There was one person who responded to him essentially saying that, and also pointing out that the same forces that were allegedly monkeying with the 2020 election are also allegedly monkeying with Buddhism in the West. So, there's an indirect connection anyway. But, yeah, it's just a rhetorical kind of question, I guess. So I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is by Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, can you explain how to practice mindfulness? And there are entire books on how to practice mindfulness. Pali texts describe how to practice mindfulness, like the Satipatthana Sutta and the Mahasatipatthana Sutta. They can give a much more in-depth explanation to than I can in just relatively briefly answering this question on a Q&A video. But practicing mindfulness, from my point of view, it's pretty much what Ram Dass used to say, be here now. Just be here in the present moment. And don't be thinking about the future. Don't be thinking about the past. Don't be thinking about what's going on somewhere else. Just be here now. And it's kind of interesting that St. John of the Cross also taught a kind of mindfulness where it's, in a way, it's like the opposite of memory. Like the word sati in Pali can mean mindfulness, or it can also mean memory. But strangely, in Roman Catholicism, the same word can mean both too, which is recollection. If you're being mindful, you're practicing recollection. But St. John of the Cross was saying that in a way you destroy your memory because you're just right here, right now, in the present moment. You're not thinking about the past at all. You're not thinking about the future. You're not thinking about what's down the street. You're not thinking about what's in the kitchen. So, that's essentially it. And just being right here in the present moment. And if you want to practice it at a deeper level, or you're skillful enough to practice it at a deeper level, then you start silencing the commentary. You got to silence the commentary to some degree when you're being mindful. Just your mind has always got these sentences, words just going on and on, this kind of logorrhea. You're trying to still that also to help you being in the present moment, because Like Krishnamurti used to say, when you're living in words, you're not living in the present. You're always living in the past. Because, I mean, it might just be a few seconds or even a, split second, but still you're not dealing with the present moment when you're thinking in words. So in order to live in the present moment, it's good to just stop thinking in words as much as possible. Or if you have to think in words, then, you're just directing your thoughts to what is going on right here, right now. It might be that you have to think under certain circumstances. So you use your thoughts as necessary. But just the running commentary stuff, you try to get rid of that. And in a way, it's like sense restraint, where you're just trying to get as close to just bare sensory data as you can. So, like I've said a number of times on these videos, like, for example, if you're doing mindfulness of hearing and there's a dog barking outside, you're not thinking, oh, there's that dog barking outside again. It's just, you just hear it as just sound. You're not even identifying it as barking dog. It's just, you are aware of the sound, and that's it. When the sound stops, the awareness of the sound stops, you don't continue thinking about it, that you're just right here in the present moment, and you're not using like language in your head to have this commentary going about what's going on, where you're just associating this with that and so forth. You just stay focused in the present moment. That's essentially what mindfulness is. Although some kinds of mindfulness can have different meanings, but in general, that's what people are mainly talking about when they're talking about mindfulness in the sense of Buddhist practice. So I'll just move on to the next question, also from Jodo. And he says, can you make a video explaining the Eightfold Path and a video on how to meditate, please? Well, I've talked quite a lot about the Eightfold Path, and I'm pretty sure I've also done at least one video just on meditation. But that was mainly about the 40 kinds of meditation. Is how to do each of the 40 kinds of meditation that are on the standard list of the 40 kinds of meditation. I think it's in the Visuddhimagga. With regard to a video explaining the Eightfold Path, yeah, I've given talks about the Eightfold Path before. I suppose I could. It's not going to be this video, I suppose. But I do consider the eightfoldness of the path to be another anachronism, or likely anachronism. I would be mildly surprised if the Buddha really did teach the eightfoldness of the Eightfold Path, because there are like earlier prototypes. There's like a tenfold path also in the suttas that apparently didn't get enough traction, and so that one didn't really make it in the long run. Yeah, make a video explaining the Eightfold Path. I could. As a general rule, that kind of thing doesn't interest me a whole lot, because it's sort of elementary Buddhism that I'm just not really interested in like going over the really elementary stuff over and over again. I do in these Q&As sometimes, but yeah. And with regard to how to meditate, aside from the video I've already done on the 40 kinds of meditation in Buddhism, there'd just be a few things like on posture and so forth. I suppose I could do it, but mostly when I do videos, I just do something that I'm just kind of thinking about, it's sort of hot in my mind at the time. So maybe I'll get inspired to do it, but I'm probably not going to do it anytime real soon. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, you seem to have a pretty low opinion of the Theravada Abhidhamma. What is your opinion on the Sarvastivadin Abhidharma? And it is true that I don't really have a very high opinion of the Theravada Abhidhamma, the Abhidhamma Pitaka. And most Western Buddhists don't. I've been told that approximately 70% of Western Buddhist monks don't have any use for Abhidhamma. And it's pretty obviously late. It pretty obviously was not taught by the Buddha himself. It probably did not exist. It certainly did not exist as a Pitaka, as one of the three baskets of the Pali texts, until the third council, which was quite a while after the time of the Buddha, like mid-3rd century BC. So the Sarvastivadin Abhidharma, I have less knowledge of it. And I was, as a monk especially, I was exposed to information about Abhidhamma over and over again, especially because I was living in Burma most of the time, and the Burmese take Abhidhamma extremely seriously. They consider it to be the most profound, most important teachings of the Buddha, which is one reason why I've had such a low opinion of it, is because, you know, I've been living in the midst of this culture, this Buddhist culture that is just saying that, you know, Abhidhamma is the most important, deepest part of Buddhism. And from a Western point of view and a historical objective point of view, it's hardly likely that the Buddha even taught it. And a lot of it, I'm sure the Buddha would not agree with, that he would not endorse it. But with regard to Sarvastivadin, I know very little about it. You know, I know just a few things about it. I do know that it's very different from Theravada, and it may be that Theravada and Sarvastivadin, it wasn't until the third council that they split apart. And so the Sarvastivadins are probably working on their own version of Abhidharma or Abhidhamma around the time of the third council. And it was just sort of a doctrinal, like a schism practically, where one of the main purposes of the third council was to purge the Sarvastivadins. That's the impression I get from reading the history of it. So, yeah, I mean, Sarvastivadin, it did have certain differences. Like, they believed that past, present, and future are all real in a sense, which is probably more correct than the Theravadin position that only the present moment exists, that the past no longer exists, the future doesn't exist yet. So, in that sense, the Theravadins are more Newtonian, and the Sarvastivadins are more Einsteinian, you know, going with like the time-space continuum, that, you know, time is itself just another dimension through space, or, you know, through the cosmos. Also, the Sarvastivadins believed that an individual atom, you know, a ultimately real dharma, you know, they divided, you know, the whole world, samsara, up into all these different elements, like Theravada did. But according to Theravada, these elements are flashing in and out of existence at a rate of like a trillion times an eye blink, whereas according to Sarvastivadins, they are eternal. It's just that the combinations of these elements are like impermanent, which that also would come closer to modern science, I think. Then again, I'm not sure what the modern scientific idea of like an electron or a quark, some subatomic particle, I mean, is it really staying the same, or is it like in this constant state of flux? But even probably the scientists wouldn't agree that everything is flashing in and out of existence a trillion times a second, especially because once everything flashes out of existence, you've got nothing, just literally nothing. And then everything has to re-arise out of nothing. And that is just a major flaw in Theravada Abhidhamma, in my opinion, which the Sarvastivadins, even though I don't think that their idea that these elements are ultimately real, at least they got rid of the problem of everything appearing out of nothing a trillion times a second. So it may be that the Sarvastivadin Abhidharma is an improvement on Theravada Abhidharma. But again, I haven't really studied it much. I've just picked up little bits and pieces about it. And so I can't really make any kind of authoritative judgment on the merits or demerits of the Sarvastivadin version of Abhidhamma. But from what little I know about it, they did make at least 2 improvements. But still trying to declare that samsara is ultimately real in some sense. Yeah, that's pushing it to me. So in that respect, I would be more inclined to go along with certain Mahayana schools that only nirvana is real. And I had a Roman Catholic priest tell me that in Roman Catholicism, at least in the seminary schools, they teach something different, or they teach something essentially the same, which is only God is ultimately real, and that this world that he created is just sort of like contingently real. It's relatively real compared to God himself. But I am digressing into the realm of Roman Catholicism. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Pseudonym. And Pseudonym says, please explain your approach to translating Pali to English. How do you approach the challenge of preserving the original meaning while doing so in readable or even poetic English? Overall, what is your translation approach? Well, I've said it before, and it has been like a main, like a guideline for me when translating. I got to check to make sure that we're recording. Yeah, 40 minutes into it, I verify that we are actually recording. That a translator should be as invisible as possible. That when you are reading an English translation of a Pali text, you should be coming as close as possible to the effect it would have on you if you were a native speaker of Pali, assuming that native speakers of Pali ever existed. That, I mean, you were fluent in Pali, and it would have as close to the same effect on you as if you were reading in the original Pali. I hope I said that right. So, I mean, when you're reading an English translation or any translation, the goal for the translator, in my opinion, should be to create as close to the original impact. Like you would have like essentially the same experience if you were reading in the original language or in the translated language. So that was like my main criterion for translating. Plus, of course, just getting the translation right. I mean, you have to think. I mean, this is definitely not postmodern. This isn't the new criticism or anything. But really, it's just obvious to me that you have to try to understand what it was that the original author was trying to say, and then you try to say it in a different language in such a way that it has like as close to the same effect when you read it that it would have on someone if they were reading it in the original Pali and they were like, that was like their first language or something. So yeah, the whole idea of like postmodernism or the precursor of postmodernism in like the new criticism where, the original intention of the author is irrelevant. I mean, that's just nonsense to me. I mean, you definitely have to try to understand, what they were saying and why they were saying it in that way. Just because there might be some nuance that they are expressing that you would want to express too in order to make it as genuine or reliable of a translation as possible. So like when I translated the Atthakavagga, that was really a challenge because the Atthakavagga is full of puns. It's full of plays on words, like words with multiple meanings. And trying to come up with an English equivalent of a pun or a play on words, trying to come up with the same word that has the same 2 or 3 possible meanings. Sometimes it was just flat out impossible. But I did the best I could, and sometimes I'd just be stewing over like one verse for months. Just not off and on, of course. I would sleep and eat and stuff. But let's see. Yeah, just trying to come up with the same subtleties in English as existed in the original Pali. Like poetry is very difficult. I mean, I didn't even try to put it into meter. Like most of the Atthakavagga is in verse. I think all of it's in verse, except for maybe a very little bit. So, yeah, I mean, trying to force fit it into meter, that was too much of a challenge for me. So, Yeah, I guess I gave my overall translation approach. Just first of all, you have to know what they're saying as best you can, and then convert that into a different language as accurately as possible, trying to catch, sort of the nuances and sort of like the overall feel of it. So it's kind of an intuitive approach, which a lot of translators would criticize and say an intuitive approach is sort of just like a non-scholarly approach. Like K.R. Norman, for example, would does not like or did not like the intuitive approach to translation. And I mean, he was saying that he didn't really care what it meant, so long he just wanted to translate what it says. But I mean, if you don't know what it means, you can't translate what it says. Like some words have multiple meanings, like the word dhamma notoriously has lots of meanings in Pali. And if you can't, I mean, if you don't know what it means from the context, then how are you going to translate it? Unless you're like the first famous Nyanamoli, who was a great translator, who tried to come up with one English word for each Pali word. So I think for Dhamma, the best he could come up with was the word idea, which probably is not so good. I didn't take that extreme. So let's see. I guess I answered that question. I mean, first of all, of course, you have to know the language and know what it's saying, and then try to translate that into a different language as seamlessly as possible and accurately as possible. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Mogambo. And Mogambo says, "Hello, Panyo. What are your views on evolution and rebirth or reincarnation? In my opinion, evolution negates the concept of rebirth. We can follow a link to our parents and can take it back as far as we want in evolutionary chart, even to the first living organisms. My theory is we get skandhas, or aggregates, khandhas, from a combination of our parents' genes, which could also include our nature and temperament. So the Buddhist view about the velocity of past karmas being carried forward into the next life makes me doubt the rebirth concept." Well, as it turns out, I pretty much have a certain amount of faith in both. A certain amount of faith in the Buddhist concept of rebirth. And also, I mean, I have to admit that evolution from a samsaric empirical point of view is just obvious. That anyone who argues against evolution has some kind of religious axe to grind. Usually they're Christian creationists. So they want to believe the Bible's true just because they're Christians. And so they're willing to reject or ignore just a mountain of evidence that life has evolved on this planet. But I do not see that they're really contradictory to each other. I mean, you can have both because they're happening at two different levels. One is like a spiritual level, and the other one is like a material level. And the spiritual level is probably more real than the material level, although probably in the West, most people would feel otherwise. So, I mean, you do have like a male and a female come together and they produce offspring, but that's not the same as rebirth. I mean, in a way, at a material level, it kind of is, because the offspring is half of the mother and half of the father genetically. So, but still, I mean, the way rebirth happens in Buddhism or Hinduism or any system that endorses the idea of rebirth or reincarnation, it's like your karma lands you exactly where you need to be. And so it's going to land you in a certain, like into a certain family with certain parents and with a certain like genetic and physical makeup. So yeah, it's like the spirit is not the same as the material. That they're just two different levels of reality, two different levels of samsaric reality anyway. But in a sense, rebirth also can be a kind of spiritual evolution. So there's that too. But Yeah, it's just the physical element is just going on at its own level, and the karma aspect is just landing us into the physical vehicle that is most appropriate for us at the time. So I really don't see that there's any conflict between the two concepts. And I do use both of them as working hypotheses in understanding the samsaric world in which I find myself situated. So I think I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Tig, and says, when is you gonna do a show on U Pandita? Well, I don't know. I've discussed U Pandita. In fact, I did a video with Brian Rue probably 2 or 3 years ago by now. Maybe it was back when I was still a monk, just discussing U Pandita. So we've already made the show on U Pandita. Also, I wrote a long essay discussing my experiences with U Pandita, especially 2 months I spent at his Pandita Rama Center in Rangoon. Which, when I come out with a fourth book, it'll be in that book, because the fourth volume of the books that I've been working on, I already got 3 published. The fourth one would be just based my personal experiences as a monk, based on that, which it would include being at Pandita Rama for 2 months. U Pandita was also present at my ordination, but he didn't seem to like me very much. I was told that he didn't like foreigners in general, but we don't need to get into that. I mean, there were certain foreigners that he obviously liked, especially if they spoke really fluent Burmese and just fit right in. But sort of like the outsiders, he didn't like too much. So, yeah, when is you going to do a show on U Pandita? We already did it. Brian Rue and I did it. Although you might have to look for it on Brian Rue's Buddhist Truthers playlist on BitChute. I'm not sure if it's on my... it's in my playlists on YouTube or BitChute, because I haven't uploaded all of the shows that I did with Brian. Some of them would just be off limits for YouTube anyway. So, yeah, it is out there already. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Rui. And Rui says, hello, Panyo. Do you think the Buddha remains silent when asked certain questions, not only to point out their ultimately unanswerable nature, but also their ignobility for those on the path? Yeah, I think the main reason why there are certain questions the Buddha didn't answer is just that they don't have answers. They're like invalid questions. Although some people have come up with the idea that the Buddha wouldn't answer them just because it had nothing to do with Dhamma, really. You know, like what happens to a Tathagata after he dies? Does he continue to exist, or does he no longer exist? The Buddha wouldn't answer. Or like the beginning of the world, or is the world infinite or is it finite? Those are questions that the Buddha just would not answer. And I think there are probably a lot more that the Buddha wouldn't answer. In fact, it may be that he wouldn't answer most questions, just based on like the Atthakavagga, where it's just saying have no view, no belief, just don't even go there. It's like radical, just being in the present moment with no mental commentary going on. Just be here now. But maybe ignobility or anarya, that would be not Aryan, would be like ignoble in Pali. Let's see. To point out their ultimate unanswerable nature, but also their ignobility for those on the path. Yeah, I mean, to the extent that it's just irrelevant to becoming enlightened, you could call that ignoble. I mean, it's not so much degrading, unless it depends on your attitude. I mean, if you're like heavily invested into whether the world, had a beginning or not, like the universe, or, if an enlightened being continues to exist after death or does not continue to exist after death. I mean, if you're just really like pretty much fanatic, or it's like, your philosophy, your whole approach to Dhamma is based on something like this, then that could be called ignoble, I suppose. So, yeah, in a way, it's like, in a way, it's kind of degrading, I guess, to just insist on, only this is true, anything else is wrong. It's like the stereotypical fool in the Pali text is someone who says, only this is true, anything else is wrong. Because really the truth, and if it really is true, it can't be put into words. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. But for some people, it could get into like a matter of ignobility. I think it would depend on the individual. So I guess I'll move on to Rui's next question here. Hello again, Panyo. This is not so much a question as perhaps a request. How would you translate the following? Oh, I forgot to look this up. I really did. I should check this out. Just a second. Let's see here. Is that it? No. Is this it? No. It's here. There it is. Okay. I knew I should have looked this up. Let's see. So anyways, he's saying, hello again, Panyo. This is not so much a request as perhaps a request. No, this is not so much a question as perhaps a request. How would you translate the following, a sort of mantra that I devised into Pali? Quote, may all beings, visible and invisible, be free and of a joyful mind, unquote. Please do take your time if you're up to the task. So, this is the wrong book anyway. Just a second again. I know it's here somewhere. Here it is. Just stepped on a dog toy. Right here. 11 Holy Discourses of Protection. The Mahaparita Pali by Sao Tun Mat Win, who I believe is Shan living in Burma. So anyways, this quote that he had reminds me very much of the Metta Sutta. There's something very similar already translated in the Metta Sutta. Let's see. Deta wa ye. Let's see. Deta wa ye wa adeta. Ye wa dure wasandi ovidure. Buddha wa samwesi wa sabasata bawandu sukidata. So it's those that are seen and those that are not seen. Let's see. Those that are far away and those that are near. Those that are in existence and those who are waiting for existence. May all beings be happy-minded. So, yeah, I guess I should, maybe in the comments, I should come up with it, but I forgot to work it out. May all beings visible and invisible. So visible and invisible is just deta wa ye adeta, which is seen or unseen. And the be free part is the only part that's missing from the Metta Sutta. But that would be like, it depends on what kind of free. I mean, liberated would be like, we mokandu, may they be free. We mokandu, or pamokandu. Mokandu, like moksha in Sanskrit, is like liberation or freedom. So may all beings, sabe sata, visible and invisible, deta wa ye, deta wa ye wa adeta, would be seen or unseen. May they be free is wimokandu, and of a joyful mind is bawandu sukidata. So, sabe sata, deta wa ye wa adeta, wimokandu, cha, bawandu sukidata. And if I just butchered the grammar, I apologize. So, yeah, I mean, almost the same thing, except for the free part is just right out of the Metta Sutta. And it is good to just, the Metta Sutta is kind of long for a mantra, but it is, if you only know how to recite one text, the Metta Sutta is a good one to recite. And there are millions of people who have recited it. So in a way you can kind of get some, like join the momentum of all these reciters of the Metta Sutta. But I suppose I could, if I think of it, I can like type it out into the comments. So I guess I'll just move on to this question here. And this is from Gamma Spectrologist. And Gamma Spectrologist says, regarding the flame job that allegedly lit himself on fire in protest of genocide, a lot of people are saying it was fake, which turned into the claim the famous Vietnamese monk that did the same decades ago was fake also. How does Buddhism look at suicide like this? And how possible do you think an alleged advanced Buddhist could just sit there roasting his flesh and not react even in the slightest? So I guess this is kind of two questions. I mean, the first question is, what would be the Buddhist attitude towards immolating yourself or just committing suicide? And the Buddha does say in the Pali text that, I mean, you shouldn't kill yourself until you're done. You know, if you become enlightened, then you could commit suicide, I suppose, which was kind of a tradition among some like early Indian like spiritual movements, like the Jains. Once they figured that they had reached the ultimate, that they had exhausted all of their karma, they just went off and they didn't burn themselves or commit any kind of violent suicide, because that would be making new karma. They would just squat down and not move until they were dead. But yeah, Buddhism would not approve of committing suicide unless, I mean, it was somehow became the lesser of two evils. But so it doesn't really, at least Theravada would not approve of committing suicide as a matter, as a kind of protest, like political protest or whatever. Yeah, that, I mean, it wouldn't be as bad as killing somebody else. You know, killing yourself isn't as bad as killing somebody else. But still, it's kind of counterproductive, because you're ending your life before you have reached liberation. But let's see. So I already answered that part of the question. So let's see. Do you think an alleged advanced Buddhist could just sit there roasting his flesh and not react even in the slightest? Yeah, I think that's possible. Partly because I have read that if you really are immolating yourself, like the nerve endings on your skin are all going to be destroyed within a matter of seconds. So it would just be like the first few seconds when you'd be in searing agony, and then you just kind of go numb. Plus, you'd probably be in a state of shock by then. But also, a lot of Buddhists, I mean, they're professional ascetics. You know, they learn to be okay with discomfort and to some degree even pain. And so, yeah, a lot of Buddhists could just sit in relatively severe pain and not move, especially if you know, there's a crowd watching them. You know, they're not just going to start flailing around and screaming and stuff like a lot of normies would do, obviously. You know, they've got a lot of self-discipline, mental self-discipline, detachment. They can detach from just mere mental or physical sensations, that kind of a thing. A certain amount of equanimity. You know, there's a lot of mentions of this kind of thing in the text, like Kantiwadi, you know, the Buddha in a previous existence who got just pieces of his body chopped off one by the king of Kalinga, because he was talking to the king of Kalinga's harem girls at a park one day. So the king of Kalinga was jealous and pissed off, so he just started having parts of this ascetic's body cut off one by one, and the ascetic did not feel any ill will or any such thing. So yeah, it's definitely possible. Partly just because, as I said earlier, like your pain receptors on your skin are going to be roasted and destroyed within a matter of seconds, and then you're going to be in like a state of shock, and or at least your body will be. And then it's true that a lot of the training that a serious monk undergoes, you know, not just some ordinary scholar monk living in some cushy monastery in a Buddhist university or something, but like a monk who's like a forest ascetic kind of practitioner who has made a lifelong or a decades long practice of just being okay with pain and discomfort, just sort of detaching from it. Yeah, I think it's very possible, and I have no doubt that the Vietnamese monk, at the very least, really did just sit there in meditative posture while he burned. So I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Arain. And Arain says, can you speak about Scientism as a modern religion and how dharmic it is? How about the priest class of Scientism, the modern scientist who is beholden to the corporate or political and academic funding that controls their scientific doctrine? How can the ancient knowledge of Buddhist philosophy save us from the modern cults? So I guess that's two questions. Actually, there's more than two question marks here, but I'm turning it into two questions here. So the first is talking about Scientism as a modern religion, how dharmic it is, and the priest class of Scientism, which is the modern scientist. Also, it'd be like the modern professor of science at universities, and who is beholden to the corporate and political and the academic funding that controls their scientific doctrine. And then the second question is, how can the ancient knowledge of Buddhist philosophy save us from the modern cults? Okay, so Scientism really is a kind of religion. It's like an atheistic religion, sort of like Marxism, although it's better than Marxism because it's based less on dogma and more on empiricism. I mean, that's what made science as strong as it is that it is based on objectivity, rationality, and empiricism. And it didn't start off as being atheistic. I mean, that was one of the early goals of early modern scientists, was they wanted to see the world the way God sees the world. You know, they were Christians back in those days, you know, like, oh, what's his name? Isaac Newton, John Locke, those guys. They were Christians. At least, I mean, they didn't have any choice but to be Christians because of the culture back then, but they were Christians. So, but science in and of itself is amoral. You know, morality is not a scientific word, really. Like good and bad are really not scientific words. It's just trying to understand the phenomenal universe just based on observation and recognizing patterns that can repeat so that you can make predictions with regard to what's going to happen in the future, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, to the extent that it really is trying to understand reality, trying to deal with truth, then that's relatively dharmic. To the extent that it's honest science, then, you know, honesty is a virtue in dharma. So, I mean, it's not really otherworldly. It's not, you know, its goal is not enlightenment or liberation or heaven, salvation, anything like that. In a way, it's sort of, science is trying to build an intellectual Tower of Babel that will reach all the way up into the heavens of omniscience, and it's doomed to fail in that regard. So, yeah, it is a modern religion, though, and it is based on articles of faith. It's not entirely based on just objectivity and empiricism. There are articles of faith in Scientism. I mean, there's just the beginning article of faith is that there is even an external physical world out there that we can observe, or that a little blob of gray meat in our head has the capacity to understand reality, or that it's even possible, even in theory, to understand reality intellectually. Or, you know, there's the matter of faith that it's pretty much of necessity that the future will behave the way the past did, that the laws of physics aren't going to change, that sort of thing. You know, there are articles of faith in science, and I've written about that a lot. I think one of my books that is for sale on Amazon, it's in the links below, if YouTube is not still smiting me for discussing a forbidden subject and allows me to post links to this video. So yeah, in a way, it's like a modern religion. It's based on articles of faith, and I mean, not to the extent of, you know, most so-called religions or Marxism either. That Marxism is just as dogmatic and based on articles of faith as any of the older religions, which is why it doesn't work very well, because so much of it just isn't true. So I guess I answered that part. So it'd be more of a philosophy than a religion, but it would have certain religious aspects, because I mean, I've I was in academia. I majored in marine biology, and you have interactions with professors and just starry-eyed grad students who are just gung-ho on science. I mean, they really do think that science is like has replaced religion, which it kind of has, especially in the West. And it's like the new religion essentially. They have like a religious. I mean, it's like they have this attitude of they want to dedicate their life to just contributing some humble little brick to this intellectual Tower of Babel. So, yeah, there's definitely religious elements about scientism. And scientism, I should point out, isn't necessarily the same as just science. Like empirical science is one thing. Scientism is this belief that science really does explain reality. And it comes in a way closer than Abhidhamma does, at least with regard to explaining the material, so-called the seemingly material world. So I guess I answered that part of the question. See, the next part here is how about the priest class of scientism, the modern scientist or professor, who is beholden to the corporate, political, and academic funding that controls their scientific doctrine. Yeah, a scientist can be bought as easily as a politician can. In fact, I would say that a lot of scientists can be bought even more easily than a politician, because a politician has to have a certain brazenness to him. Whereas a scientist, they could just be this wimpy, geeky person that didn't have any social life, and they just wanted to make something of themselves by getting a PhD and becoming a scientist and contributing to the aforementioned intellectual Tower of Babel. There are a lot of scientists who really were just like geeky kids with no social life, and they're not particularly brave people. And so if they're going to get defunded and not get any more promotions for discussing something like, oh, the Great Barrier Reef is doing fine. It's just the expansion and contraction of the reef is due to natural cycles. And there was a professor in Australia who I'm pretty sure lost his job for saying just that, because it just went against the official narrative that the politicians are pushing. So, I mean, if they're threatened, I think that they would buckle more easily than the average politician or judge. So I think they're relatively easy to buy. I mean, if they're going to get lots of funding for doing a study for the government with the predetermined conclusion that such and such is good for you or such and such is bad for you, then they'll go along and do it, and they'll make considerable money and publish something and get a better name for themselves, rather than do the opposite and become a pariah, maybe lose their job. And I mean, it's always been that way. Science is always driven by economics. I mean, funding is going to be with regard to something that is economically important. Like I majored in marine biology, like I mentioned. And I mean, if you're going to study a certain fish species, for example, then if it's economically important fish species, like a species of salmon or cod or something, you're going to find all kinds of information. But if you're going to do a study on some kind of fish that would be considered a junk fish, I mean, it's not good to eat, it has no economic value, there's going to be very little information on that. So, I mean, it's always been that way. But it's worse now, and I think science is really being vitiated. It's being corrupted and degraded lately, just because of sort of postmodernism and the idea that truth is just a social construct. We can make the truth be whatever we want it to be. And like the powers that be, the elites who've got most of the money, have that idea. And so they pressure scientists to okay certain things and condemn other things and just completely ignore other things. And I mean, it's happening a lot. I mean, tenure is almost irrelevant at this point, because if you publish studies, if you can even get them published, that are with regard to something politically incorrect, differences among ethnicities or something like that, I mean, that's it. I mean, your career can be destroyed. So consequently, you've got really high profile, prestigious scientific and medical journals like Nature and the Lancet, who are going along with this idea that the difference between male and female is just a cultural construct. So yeah, science is in decline now. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question sort of. And so then the last part of this question, how can the ancient knowledge of Buddhist philosophy save us from the modern cults? We'll just keep dharma in mind. And if you're going to be interested in science also, I mean, it should be compatible with dharma. That, I mean, yeah, I think just being grounded in dharma, you know, it keeps you stable and keeps you from just being lost, getting, you know, drawn one way or the other off the middle path. So the ancient knowledge of Buddhist philosophy can save us from modern cults simply because, I mean, you're just not going to believe the modern cults because you're already believing dharma, if you're believing anything at all. Or, I mean, you don't want to go with the radical mysticism of the Atthakavagga, and it tells you not to believe anything, then that's going to protect you from the modern cults also. At least it's going to protect you from becoming a member of the modern cults, although members of the modern cults might try to get you for just not being one of them, or for daring to tell the truth. You tell too much truth, or just your honest opinion, and you can get in trouble. You can get videos taken down from YouTube, for example. I mean, that's just a minor example. I mean, you can wind up just really in big trouble. So, I think I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Indian guy, alias Trevor. And Indian guy, alias Trevor, says, I finally have a question! Exclamation mark. Exclamation mark. Man. So, I finally have a question! Exclamation mark. In the middle-length discourse under all the taints, Sabasava is the Pali, the Buddha explains there are taints, or asavas, that need to be abandoned by using. I'm wondering, what do you think he means by there are taints or cankers that need to be abandoned by using? I think it might mean you have to use certain things that suck so you know what they are and not do it again. The second question mark is rhetorical. So it's really one question. You grammar Nazi, Heil Punyo, LOL. So there's a few things that, I mean, just sort of as an introduction to this question, that the discourse he's referring to is the second discourse of the Majjhima Nikaya, called the Sabasava Sutta. And it's the discourse on all the asavas. And asawa, Bhikkhu Bodhi translated as taint, which I don't think is a good translation. Literally, asawa, it's based on the verb sawadhi, which means to flow. So sawadhi means to flow. Asawa means it's flowing towards you instead of away from you. So I think it was Ajahn Thanisaro that said that the Buddhists got the term asawa and the idea for asawa from the Jains. And the Jains believed that you have a soul, or jiva, that if it's completely uncorrupted by karma, it'll just float up into this eternal heaven. But because it's corrupted by karma, it's like weighed down. And the Jains, and also to some degree the Sarvastivadin Buddhists, considered karma to be kind of like almost like a physical substance. It was sticky and would stick to your soul. At least the Jains believed that karma would, it was an asawa. It would flow in and stick to you. So my translation of asawa is encumbering influence, which is kind of long and clunky, but it really it describes it better. Like, influence is literally exactly the same as asawa, the same meaning. It's something that flows in, influence. But it's not just any influence, it's like an encumbering influence, something that weighs you down. So the Buddha in Majjhima Nikaya number 2, which is an important sutta, is a cardinal discourse, which is one reason why they've got it towards the beginning. Usually in these sutta collections, the first sutta And sometimes the first several suttas are considered to be like really important ones. So it wound up being number 2. So let's see here. The Buddha explains that there are taints, or asawas, encumbering influences that need to be abandoned by using. And he's saying, and Indian guy here is wondering, what do you think he means by there are taints or cankers that need to be abandoned by using? Yeah, and canker is another old rendering of the word asawa. And the fact that you've got so many different renderings indicates that it's a hard term to really understand for a lot of people. But if you read the sutta, that there are some things, some asawas, that have to be abandoned through use. And you read the sutta, you see that things that are abandoned through use, or the things that you use, are the 4 requisites, which is alms food, alms food, clothing, shelter, and medicine. And those are just necessary. You have to use those. So at least if you get sick and need a place to stay and so forth. So, you can't really avoid the 4 requisites. And so you have to overcome your asawas, your like attachments, through using them with detachment. And the sutta itself has these recollections. You're supposed to think about these things to help you detach from the 4 requisites. And as a junior monk, I had to recite this in Pali every day. It's like with regard to alms food, the thing that you chant, and it's right in the sutta, is I use this alms food, not to beautify myself, not for sensual pleasure, but only to keep my body healthy and strong enough to continue practicing Dhamma. And so you just reflect on this so that you can use the requisites with detachment, and that helps you to abandon any kind of clingy attachments that would be asawas in the Buddhist sense. So, at the end of the section of abandoning the asawas through use, the quote is, while taints, vexation, and fever might arise in one who does not use the requisites thus, there are no taints, vexation, or fever in one who uses them thus. That's Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation. And that's reflecting on the wise use of the 4 requisites. Because you're not supposed to avoid the 4 requisites. Although, at every monk's ordination, he is admonished that when he is sick, that he should content himself with drinking fermented urine as medicine. So with that in mind, I'll just move on to the next question here. This is from Fred. And Fred says, question: what would one do if you have a vindictive patron on alms round? I think it would be a possibility. And I'm not sure what he means by a vindictive patron. If they really hate you, they wouldn't be much of a patron. It could be that he's referring to somebody on alms round that wants to put like dog shit or something into your bowl. And I've been told that sort of thing has happened before, where you got someone who just disapproves of you, or disapproves of your monastery, or disapproves to the sect of Theravada Buddhism that you are following, and they'll just put something really just deliberately disgusting into your bowl. And in a case like that, you're not required to accept it. If it's obviously offered in bad faith, then you're not required to accept it. But you're not supposed to like rebuke the person. You're supposed to just remain silent and modest and meek. And you might refuse it, and you just continue on your way. Or if they're like people yelling at you, or just mocking you, then ideally you just send metta to them, not say anything, and just continue on your way. So I think maybe I answered that question. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from 5 Precept Pete. And 5 Precept Pete asks kind of an interesting question to me. Who is your favorite great disciple of the Buddha? And when I was a junior monk especially, I had 2 favorite great disciples. One was Mahakassapa, who was the great disciple who was outstanding with regard to following Dhutanga, or the optional ascetic practices. And all of the great disciples, I should mention, are outstanding in some respect or another. So they're outstanding in one way, and then or they're a great disciple who is the one who is outstanding in this respect. So Mahakassapa was the most outstanding with regard to following the Dhutangas at the highest level. He was just a super ascetic. So he was one of my favorites. He was kind of held up before me as a kind of role model. Like I've mentioned before how when I was a very junior monk, I was instructed to read the Mahakassapa's verses in the Therigatha, which is a text of Arahant testimonies put into verse. And Mahakassapa's verses are about a time when he was going for alms, and a beggar with leprosy saw him going for alms and was inspired by his nobility of demeanor, his serenity, and he just looked like he was really a wise, good person. And so this beggar with leprosy was inspired to take some food from his own bowl and put it into Mahakassapa's bowl. So he asked Mahakassapa. Mahakassapa just accepted in silence. And so as this beggar is taking some food and putting it into Mahakassapa's bowl, because he has leprosy, one of his fingertips breaks off and lands in the bowl. And Mahakassapa doesn't raise an eyebrow. He just accepts it with serenity. And the beggar, on the other hand, he's kind of mortified. He's very ashamed and embarrassed. And so he follows Mahakassapa just to see what he's going to do. If he's just going to throw all the food out or something. So Mahakassapa, after he gets enough food, he continues going for alms. And then when he gets enough food, he sits down at the base of the city wall to eat his meal. And he doesn't even take the fingertip out of the bowl. He just moves it over to one side and then eats his meal. So that was sort of held up as an ideal of austerity when I was a junior monk. And I have to admit, I had a lot of respect for Mahakassapa, who became the Buddha's successor after the Buddha died. Mahakassapa was senior monk in the Sangha who presided over the first great council and so forth. But I also had another favorite great disciple that most people probably have never heard of, and that is Rewada the Doubter, who's mentioned a few times in Vinaya. And I think he is considered to be the great disciple who was most outstanding with regard to his scrupulousness with regard to following Vinaya rules. And Rewada the Doubter, he would see things going on and start having doubts about Vinaya, and then the Buddha would have to set him straight on it. Like one time, he was passing by some people making lumps of sugar, probably palm sugar. I'm not sure what kind of sugar it was, but they were putting a little bit of flour into it to help it stick together. Sort of like powdered sugar has some kind of starch or something in it to keep it from sticking together. But I guess at the sugar mill in ancient India, they were putting a certain amount of wheat flour or rice flour into the sugar mixture just to make the balls stick together, because they'd sell them in lumps. And it's called gula, which literally means lump. And so Rewada the Doubter, he saw they're putting flour into the sugar. So then he's thinking, well, can't eat sugar in the afternoon because it's got flour in it. And even though sugar is allowable in the afternoon, the flour isn't. So then the Buddha says, well, so long as it's so much sugar that it's just called sugar, that any trace amounts of other ingredients can be ignored. So then Rewada the Doubter was allowed to eat sugar again. He did that 2 or 3 times in the Pali, in the rules of monastic discipline. And so I just liked him, because when I was a young monk, I was trying to be very strict with regard to monastic discipline, and he was sort of a role model, because he was like really going for it, and any situation that was doubtful, he would just not do it. So I'll just move on to the next question here. And this is the last person asking questions, and this is Avenity. And Avenity, I believe, is the biological mate of a person who usually asks the questions instead of her. And so there are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. But considering that she's asking on behalf of this other guy, I think we can just attribute 3 to one person and 2 to the other person, so it's still okay. So, no, it's only 4 questions anyway. So Avinity says, hi, I've been asked by one of your most avid viewers, her biological mate, to send you these questions. So the first question is, if our thoughts aren't our thoughts, how and why can we be blamed for them? Well, that's an interesting question. If our thoughts aren't our thoughts, how and why can we be blamed for them? Well, at the level that they aren't our thoughts, there's no we to be blamed. See, if you're dealing with anatta, no self, then there just is no self, ultimately. I mean, at the conventional worldly level, we can say, yeah, I exist, and Joe down the street exists, and all this. But at the level of ultimate reality, there is no individual person. So, I mean, there are no individual thoughts, really, even. Although that's kind of going against Abhidhamma. We don't want to do that too much. So, at the level where there is an us, at the level where you're accepting the existence of individual people, then our thoughts are our thoughts and we can be blamed for them. But when you get to the level where there are no individual people anymore, then there's nobody to blame. So it depends on what level you're dealing with. It depends on how you look at it. Okay, I think I answered that question. So I'll just move on to the next question here. How did you grieve the death of your father? Yeah, that was weird. I was living in Burma at the time. I was living in a cave in Burma. And when I was going for alms in Lamye village, and somebody told me that a supporter of mine in Rangoon had sent me the word that my teacher, Venerable Pakogu Sayadaw, or Tongpulu Chaltsin Doya Sayadaw, he went by more than one name, Sayadaw Usurya, that he had died. So I wanted to know when the funeral was going to be. So I asked one of my supporters to find out. But in those days, in that part of Burma, in order to make a phone call, you had to rent a boat or find a boat and cross the river. There was a village on the other side of the river that had one phone. This was back before everyone had cell phones. And so she went across the river and made the phone call and came back. And she came to see me, and she said in just this voice, just soft as like down, just the softest voice, I have some bad news. Do you want to hear it? And I just knew right then and there my father was dead. Because it'd probably be only that would cause such a soft voice on the behalf of a female supporter. And it was correct. My father also had died right about the same time as my teacher did. Although my father was my first teacher, I guess. So it was weird in that I did not cry. I didn't cry when either of my parents died. I did cry when I gave my dog away, just like a year ago, less than a year ago. But for some reason, something that heavy that hits, it's like it's just going beyond just superficial reactions like that, I guess. So I just had like this empty feeling in my chest for more than a week. It was just like this hollow feeling in my chest. And in sort of in honor of my father, it's kind of weird. It might not make any sense to you, but I read a story by Jack London, To Build a Fire, sort of in honor of my father. And this story by Jack London is about a man in the Arctic, a long time ago, who freezes to death because his hands are too numb to build a fire. And my father lived in Alaska for many years, and he had lots of stories about living in the Arctic. It's like when you spit and it bounces, it's 30 below zero, and if you spit and at arm's length you hear it crack and freeze, then it's 40 below, and if you spit and it cracks immediately as soon as it leaves your mouth, it's 50 below. And if you try to spit and it just freezes to your lips and you can't spit, then it's 60 below and you got to go inside because otherwise you can get like frostbite on your lungs. So he had lots and lots of stories about, living in Alaska. So in honor of him, I read that. Also, I had a picture of my father and me when I was a baby. It was one of my favorite pictures of us. and I put it on the altar in my cave, and just made a little offering of flowers to it, and kept it there for a few weeks. And that's pretty much how I grieved the death of my father. So I'll just move on to Avenity and her biological mate's next question here. Have you ever considered all people to be complete idiots? And maybe in I don't know. No, I don't think so. I mean, I was thinking maybe in times of supreme disgust, just for a second or something. But yeah, I don't consider all people to be complete idiots. I don't think I've ever considered all people to be complete idiots. I mean, pretty much everybody, except for real literal idiots, have at least some non-idiocy about them. I mean, we're more ignorant than knowledgeable in most respects. I mean, we're infinitely ignorant. So, I mean, we are a kind of glorified ape, an upgraded ape. So, yeah, I've considered all people to be upgraded apes. I've considered all people to be this sort of ignorant and kind of, I don't know, very, very flawed in certain respects. But I've never considered all people to be complete idiots. I mean, in my youth especially, I used to think the world would be a lot better off if there were no people on it. But I dislike or despise the human race much less than I did when I was, say, in my late teens and early 20s. I have a certain compassion for the human race now. I like people more, even though I'm still kind of, I don't know, kind of solitary. My sweetheart and I are solitary. Don't have much of a social life. So let's see, I'll just move on to the next question here, which is the very last question. The very last one of this Q&A. So, Avenity and her biological mate ask, one more because of course there is, does Shakyamuni Buddha mean the person from the Shakya group who is completely silent? And Muni originally meant someone who had undertaken a vow of silence. In fact, I have read that in Hindi, like in India today, someone who is maun is someone who has undertaken a vow of silence. But the word Muni, it sort of evolved, the meaning of it evolved to mean any sage. So originally Muni did mean someone who was silent, someone who had undergone a vow of silence or who just didn't speak. But by the time the Buddha was called Shakyamuni, it had just evolved to just mean a sage, an extremely wise person. So yeah, he's just the sage of the Shakyas. The Shakyas being his tribe or clan, his nationality. Well, I guess, yeah, no, it wouldn't be his nationality, but it would be his tribe or clan, his extended family, the Shakya clan or the Shakya tribe. So yeah, it doesn't imply that he was silent because he wasn't. He did talk. And that's it. That's the end. That's the end of this Q&A, aside from the concluding remarks, which are, as usual, if you like this, feel free to like and subscribe if you haven't done it already, and look at the URL links below if YouTube is not smiting me anymore and allows me to include them. If there are no URL links, you are welcome to look on one of my older videos where there are URL links. And then you can see all the other ways of viewing my material, including the books that I have for sale and so forth. So I guess that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to include them in the comments below, or if you have access to the Subscribestar account, you can ask them there. If you have access to the Discord server, you can ask them there. And be happy.